Hey everybody, this is John for Pioneer Nexus MTG coming at you with our top 5 deck lists in the Pioneer format. Now we're going to do a little bit beyond top 5 this month, as I do think it's warranted, as the Pioneer format has been shaken up a little bit compared to last month. Now, for several months we've been kind of complaining that the Pioneer format's been a little bit stagnant, with once Gruul finally receded back from the top tier of the format. We kind of had the same 5 or 6 decks consistently popping up now and again. Rogues did rise to challenge that a little bit last month. It's a deck that's kind of faded in the background, in part because of the deck on the screen in front of you. But in my opinion, after playing Rogues a little bit, it's just kind of second fiddle to what Rakdos does. Obviously, it doesn't have the same game plan exactly, but feels like a little bit worse version of Rakdos midrange, and therefore not the best deck, one of the best decks in the format. Still solid, still a deck you can win with, and does play a little bit more of a tempo game, so it's kind of in between Spirits and Rakdos midrange. However, don't really feel it's currently a top contender in the format. A new deck that is, however, is Boros Convoke. Now this is a deck that has required people to change how they build their sideboards, how they build their main decks. You're seeing wild things like Goblin Chain Whirler show up in Rakdos midrange. You're seeing another deck that we'll talk about in a minute showing back up in the top tier decks after not being relevant for a while, etc. That's Boros Convoke. Now this deck is, its closest ancestor would probably be the Gruul Bushwhacker deck that used Burning Tree Emissary, Reckless Bushwhacker, a bunch of hasty creatures, and a Tarkus command, deal a whole bunch of damage. This deck does something very similar in that it's trying to put, Thruben Inspectors, Voldaren Epicures, Legion Loyalists on the battlefield early. Ideally, you'd like to cast a Gleeful Demolition, and then you're convoking out Venerated Loxodons and Knight Errant of Eos, to either draw a bunch of creatures into your hand or make your creatures absurdly large, and then you're trying to KO your opponent with Reckless Bushwhacker. Now these decks are capable of outputting an immense amount of damage, and unlike some of the other decks, they're not as vulnerable to spot removal. Now that's not to say spot removal can't serve a purpose. If you kill their 1-drop, especially on turn 1 with something like Fatal Push, you can certainly slow down their progress. However, this is a deck that can just simply overpower spot removal if that's all your opponent has going for it. So, unlike other aggro decks, it does have reasonable game against Rakdos midrange, does have reasonable sideboard cards like Invasion of Gob'Takan or whatever, as well as things like Experimental Frenzy, Wedding Announcement, etc. This is certainly a deck to keep an eye on. We've played it a little bit on the channel. It's been very impressive when it shows up. And is certainly a deck to keep an eye on and maybe a top 5 staple going forward. Now, another deck that has kind of made a resurgence as a result of that is Rakdos Sac. Now, Rakdos Sac is the quintessential prey on creature decks deck, especially when you have something like Mayhem Devil that can just ping all of your opponent's tokens and 1/1s. Beyond that, a card like Voldaren Thrillseeker, sacrifice this, deals damage power to any creature, can easily be a 3/3 when it comes into play. And then the rest of it, you're just playing, Cat Oven, you're playing Deadly Dispute, Blood Tithe Harvester. Dreadhorde Butcher isn't necessarily a staple, but gives this version a little bit more of an aggressive slant. And then beyond that, you get to play things like Cunning the Firstborn, steal your opponent's stuff, use it to fuel your Witches' Ovens or Deadly Disputes. This is just a deck that is very good against creature decks, and also historically, now I don't know how true this is right now, has given Rakdos midrange fits. So if you have a deck that is very good against the aggressive decks and very good against Rakdos midrange, and has a decent clock as well as some disruption against the combo decks, such as Lotus Field combo, you're in a decent spot. I think the biggest weakness this deck has is the kind of struggles against a deck like Mono Green, but overall this is a deck that has made a resurgence largely to prey upon the presence of Boros Convoke. Number 5 would be Grease Fang combo. Not really anything new here. Maybe some new sideboard cards in the form of Shieldred and Shieldred the Apocalypse showing up. Shieldred showing up in the new lists. Really it comes down to whether you want to play Traverse or Eldritch Evolution. But beyond that, you're doing the same thing. You're doing self-mill, trying to put one of your various vehicles into the graveyard, bring it back with Grease Fang. You have a very good early clock, a decent backup mid-range game plan, and this is a deck that does very solid overall. Obviously, it requires a certain type of hate that most of the rest of the format doesn't currently, other than a deck like Is It Phoenix. So this is certainly a deck that can do well. Struggles against decks like Boros Convoke showing up with Tormod's Crypts and Rending Volleys, But overall, one of the faster decks in the format, solid addition, and one of your top 5 decks in the format. A little bit controversial to put blue-white control this low, but it is a solid deck that does perform well against the other mid-range and control decks. Can be solid against something like Lotus Field combo, but can struggle against the hyper-aggressive decks, especially if you don't find your early temporary lockdowns. Doesn't have the best form of interaction. You need things like Soul Partition and March of Otherworldly Light to buy you time. You play a bunch of cheap counter spells. Change the Equation as a card that's been picking up more and more as a way to fight mono green, as well as just being a good early cheap counter against a lot of different decks. And then you get to run the dynamic duo of the Wandering Emperor and Teferi, while also having Shark Typhoon as a way to close out the game. This particular list is running Yurion. Obviously, the 80-card version is a little bit better in the grindy matchups, especially with Yurion. The 60-card version is a little bit better against the more linear decks, whether that be Lotus Field, mono green, the aggro decks. So gotta pick your poison, what you want to do there. But overall, solid deck in the format, gets to play all the good blue-white cards. What's not to like? Number 3, a deck that you figure would have dropped down significantly, and that is the presence of Lotus Field combo. Now, this is a slower combo deck, turn 4, turn 5, but you do have the presence of a Arboreal Grazer to buy you some time. You also have access to sweepers in the sideboard. So overall, solid, consistent combo deck. Fights through a lot of hate, especially against decks like Rakdos, blue-white control, etc. Still struggles against mono green, regardless of how you cut it, no matter how many Besejus, Odowaros, and natural states you put in your sideboard. But still, solid deck overall. A little bit of a dog to aggro decks, especially aggro decks that can back it up with Disruption. And probably not the best position that it's been, with Boros Convoke being such a huge portion of the format. But overall, solid combo deck, 3rd best deck in the format. Number 2, it's mono green. Probably the most powerful pound-for-pound deck in the format. Ramps on turn 1, turn 2, starts doing explosive things on turn 3, turn 4, has a toolbox with Karn the Great Creator, has overwhelming card advantage with things like Storm the Festival, a little bit of a dog to aggressive decks like Boros Convoke, although you can certainly win that matchup, and it's a little bit of a dog to decks like Spirits, Humans, etc. when those show up. The plus side, especially of late until Boros Convoke, there really hasn't been a ton of aggressive decks in the format. This is a deck that is kind of the natural predator of Rakdos midrange, although that is a bit of a close matchup, especially in the post-board games if the Rakdos player knows what the heck they're doing. One newer addition to the deck is Invasion of Ixalan. I'm not entirely sold on this card. I've played against it several times in Explorer. It feels a little bit slower and clunkier than something like Oath of Nissa, but I can see the upside of digging a couple cards deeper for 1 more mana, while also having the ability to flip into a threat. Overall, power of this deck is Nykthos and Karn. As long as those cards remain unbanned, this deck will continue to perform quite well. And in a shocker of shockers, Rakdos midrange is still the best deck in the format, despite the presence of a new deck. Oh wait, that new deck is an aggro deck. Yeah, just change some things up, put some Mihawk Maskers in your graveyard or your sideboard, along with your traditional Extinction Events, or Ritual of Soots. The rest of the deck, not much has changed. The number of Croxes fluctuates, the number of Lilianas fluctuates, the number of Bank Busters between the main and the sideboard fluctuate. But overall, this is the best deck in the format, has been for quite some time. Its numbers continue to rise ever so slightly. Some people were saying it's time for a ban with something like Fable the Mirror Breaker, maybe time to go. But solid deck overall. Deck you have to be prepared for. A deck you probably should play against a ton, unless you're in an area where people don't like to play tier decks for some reason. But overall, definitely been the best deck in the format for quite some time, and a deck you should know about. Alright, anyways, if you like these kind of informative Pioneer videos, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and we'll see you in our next video.